Providing comment on this panel is Andrew Daly, who is coming to us from the University of Memphis, where he is an assistant professor of history. He's a historian of France and the Caribbean in the period of decolonization, and he is working on a book project right now that's tentatively entitled After Negritude, The Cultural Politics of Place in Post-Colonial France and the Caribbean. This is a project that I think, if I understand correctly, sort of looks at the dom-tom in terms of the project of decolonization that would be undertaken without actual independence or the achievement of sovereignty. So a very interesting way to look at the question.
Thanks for the kind introduction. Thank you for Andal for organizing this panel and for inviting me. And so I'll keep my comments brief so we can turn it over to, as Dr. Brower said at the beginning, the most productive part of all of these sessions, which is the questions from the audience. So our panel today, From Small Wars to Nuclear Weapons, Legacies from French Military Ventures in the Middle East and North Africa, provides, I think, interesting examples to consider less about war than perhaps about l'après-guerre, that period after war. That moment at the end or just after conflict when various agents, ranging from state officials to the colonized, from intelligence services to veterans, attempt to make sense of and organize the violence of which they have just been a part. The panel opens up considerations of memory, of language, of diplomacy, of spycraft, and of war itself that point in interesting new directions for research, I think. So let me make sure I get this right. Andal Narayanan, is that the, I'm sorry? Narayanan. Andal Narayanan's paper examines competing visions of the nation and its citizens among veterans of La Guerre Sans Nom in Algeria. Formed while fighting was still ongoing in North Africa, these veterans organizations, and I'm going to attempt my own pronunciation of some very inelegant acronyms, the UNCAFN, perhaps, FANACA and UDA, which are the Union Nationale des Combattants d'Afrique du Nord, the Fédération Nationale des Anciens d'Algérie, and the Union Démocratique des Anciens d'Algérie, were very much part of the ideological and commemorative political struggles that unfolded during the war itself and in the years immediately following. In short, like France itself, the veterans of the war splintered along political, ideological lines, some supporting l'Algérie française, others decrying it. Narayanan notes that the fascist UNCAFN drew heavily from the officer corps and was most supportive of continuing to fight in Algeria. So its organ, Jebel, implored its readers to, quote, bear witness and to defend Algerie, warning that a generation of Jebels would arise that would be merciless towards those who would wrong them. From UNCAFN emerged as well many of figures of the French nationalist far right, and arguably the formation of the National Front itself. FANACA, on the contrary, was associated with the communist left and opposed the war on moral and ideological grounds. He shows that while rightist veterans deplored de Gaulle's abandonment of Algeria, FANACA partisans decried the folly of the war itself, casting themselves as a member of a wrong generation. The third grouping, UDA, thought the war a mistake but eschewed polemics for advocacy, struggling with the other two, alongside the other two groups to gain rights and recognitions for Algeria war veterans to, as he points out, gain veteran status for veterans of a war that was not a war. Andrew Orr's paper similarly begins in a French colony in the days immediately following a war, in this case mandatory Syria in the years after World War I, as France extended its sovereignty over its new Levantine mandates. Centered on a document produced by the French intelligence services, The Present Danger of Islam, Orr considers the strategic and prescriptive politics of the report's analysis, focusing on its construction of its analytic object. Such politics required, as Orr shows, conflation and flattening of a complex situation, the linking together of disparate groups, pan-Islamists, the pan-Arabic movement, and Kemal Ataturk's pan-Turkish movement, into a single unified, quote, Muslim threat to French sovereignty in the Middle East. Sounds familiar. Combining ethnographic sentiment, the Levant as the, quote, land of revelation dominated by the force of faith, which stood in contrast to Europe as the realm of reason, combining this ethnographic sentiment with real and Welt politique, French security services painted a portrait of shifting Middle East alliances that ironically mimicked the colonial act itself. Politics were delocalized and appended to the geopolitical cleavages of European power politics. The Hashemite kingdoms were cast as a British plot to unite Arabia under their rule, while the Turks were puppets of the Germans and the Soviets to extend their influence into the Middle East. Or shows how, even in understanding discontent in its mandates, French security personnel erased local peoples and overwrote their discontent with the nefarious plotting of France's uneasy ally and also with its enemies. Roxanne Panchasi's paper considers a different type of war, situating French nuclear weapons testing in the Sahara Desert during the closing days of the Algerian Revolution. I have written weapons and war in Sahara, but as Panchasi shows, such terms were under dispute, as the very definition of these terms were subject to diplomatic and political debate. France disputed that there was a war, that the Sahara was part of Algeria, or somewhat mind-bogglingly Africa, and that the weapons tested were weapons at all, insisting on anodyne descriptors like device or experiment. France's attempts to, and quite literally, define the terms of the debate was in turn contested in the UN, particularly by groups like Morocco and Ghana and other of this group of 22, which insisted that the Algerian war was indeed a war, that the Sahara was an integral part of Algeria, and the devices being tested were aggressive acts against the Algerian nation, which violated Algerian and African sovereignty and were acts of colonial violence. Her paper takes this dispute seriously, suggesting that understanding its narrative and semantic force can aid in resituating French nuclearity within its colonial dimensions and provides another dimension to the violence and amnesia of the war without a name. Otherwise, we risk giving in to what Panchasi herself describes, a certain framing convenient to the Gaullist state and to French memory of the coloniality of the French nuclear weapons program. Composing these comments, I must admit that I struggled to capture them within a single analytic frame. Trying to pair their imperatives seemed at first an impossible task, yet it was in this sort of resistance that I think I made a breakthrough, which is their incommensurableness that made them make sense. As in, each essay actually is describing that hinge between war and peace, that hinge between violence and different forms of violence, the efforts of French war veterans and the Gaullist government, French security services, France and its opponents in the UN to in fact organize and narrate the chaotic and fragmented post-war terrain in which they found themselves. Disputes over veteran status, the conflation of oppositional movements and mandatory states, arguments over the very terms of a war itself were all attempts to narrate order out of disorder, to render legible and graspable incommensurate moments that defied and even escaped legibility. Narrating the war experience produced an ordered world in which those that fought and suffered under it could make sense of their experience. But it also produced policies that would shape or perhaps deform memories and understandings of conflict for decades to come. Attending to these narrative attempts to organize the disparate legacies of conflict is to attend to a different but no less monumental form of combat. I'll close my comments with a few questions, and this first one pivots off something that Roxanne mentioned in her paper, which is the temporality of war itself. In each of these papers, I was really struck by the question of when a war was, or when it begins, ends, or even existed. And it asked the panelists to return to this perhaps in their comments. So in the case of Algeria, for example, the debate, of course, revolved for decades around the question of whether there had even been a war at all. And as both Andal's and Roxanne's papers point out, the Algerian conflict extended well beyond the temporal borders that even we historians have sketched out for our use, 1954 to 1962, with these disputes over the war's status, veteran benefits, and the testing of nuclear weapons occurring outside this more commonplace frame. In Andrew's paper, it seems like World War I never actually ended, but was rather transferred to the Middle East, with the great power conflicts, in fact, translated into local political disputes. So in short, is there really an après to la guerre? Something else I am curious about are the ambiguities and ambivalences and perhaps repressions within the source material itself. In navigating the tricky terrain of a post-war world or post-war worlds, in what ways did the documents you consult betray the confusion of the moment itself? Thinking of Andal's paper, I'm curious about the different ways in which the veterans groups define and describe themselves. So just purely off the very, basically is in their names, right? Is one, the conservative is Algérie, is Afrique du Nord. The other two are Algerie, right? That seems significant to me. So for the communists of Fanaka, it made more sense to think of themselves as veterans, but for the conservatives of Unkafen, so invested in l'Algérie Française and the contiguity of what they saw as national territory, how did they take on this mantle of veteran? Was it something that they were comfortable with defining themselves as? In Roxanne's and Andrew's papers, I'm curious if the officials betrayed the ambivalences of their own discourses, if they or their prose paused at the complex narrative operations they performed in denying a war was a war or a bomb was a bomb, or linking such disparate movements as pan-Islamism with pan-Turkishness. In short, did these texts betray the anxieties of their creation? In fact, did they sort of betray perhaps a fundamental repression of a shameful event, which seems to be at the heart of all three of these sort of narrative attempts to escape a shameful moment? And finally, I'll close by asking one final sort of global question about the question of violence and how its various forms, physical, political, commemorative, scientific, narrative, epistemic, and so on, intersect and interact. In all three papers, we see examples of attempts to grapple with, organize, make sense of, and deploy violence for political and counter-political ends. I'd ask all three panelists to comment on how they figure violence, how they see their subjects figuring violence, and to reflect on violence as constitutive yet also disruptive force in our own historical art. Thank you.
Okay, we are filming this panel, so we can sort of go, leave people people can take the questions as they're seated. That'll work technically and so forth. Okay, good. Okay, perfect. And we have a microphone that we'll be using for people in the audience. Let me invite the panel first to respond to, if you would like to take this opportunity to respond to Andrew's comments. And in this particular way, I don't know if there's a particular order that might come out of that, or if someone has something at the top of their head they'd like to pick up on this now. Okay, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much for your successful attempt to struggle with how disparate all these topics were. But I liked the question that you opened with about when does a war begin, and is there even a post-war that we're all looking at? And for the case of my subject, it seems like there are several points at which the post-war might be said to begin. As Dr. Panchazi mentioned, in 1962, that was the first time that the French government tacitly acknowledged that it had been at war because of the signing of the peace treaty or a ceasefire. For the French veterans who fought in the war, I think perhaps the post-war began in 1974 when the state symbolically opened veterans recognition, even though it would be very difficult to obtain for decades. And I think also the year 1999 saw a good deal of closure, at least for these veterans, because that was the moment when the government officially acknowledged that there had been a war. And it's strange to consider that the Fifth Republic was able to acknowledge veterans before it acknowledged that they had fought in a real war. And also, I appreciated your question about the ambiguity of source materials and labels, and your specific question about how the veterans groups describe themselves and perceive themselves as veterans. And this is something that I'm still trying to tease out myself, but I think that was a very good point you made, that the conservative pro-French Algeria group, the UNC-AFN, called themselves veterans of North Africa. So they identified strongly with the colonial mission, and they didn't specifically call themselves veterans of Algeria, but rather veterans of a conflict to hold on, a broader conflict to hold on to our North African possessions. And I would say that this conservative veterans group was most proud to take on the mantle of veteran. In their eyes, it justified their testifying in society. Again, one of my interviews with the man who founded this group, he told me we were not worthy witnesses unless we were recognized as veterans. So the way that the conservative veterans acted as veterans in society was by raising their voices on political matters, that had nothing to do with decolonization often, and also commemorating and frequent medal giving ceremonies to the extent that the leftist groups made fun of them for, just being covered with medals. So I think it was, even though they came out on the wrong side of history, I think it was easier for them to assume the mantle of veterans because they had been true believers to begin with, if that makes sense.
I think the question is, class, he talks about, he has this nice expression, I won't be able to reproduce it, but war as it rumbles away in peacetime. Maybe it rumbles away in peacetime. And one of the things I think, in particular about the veterans that was evoked by your paper, is Alex Jetty's this novel, won the Goncourt a couple of years ago, L'Art Français de la Guerre. And the argument he makes is that the wars of decolonization, the Second World War, rumble away very, very loudly in contemporary France, in particular. So that might be something we could think about. But in terms of periodization, I think the nuclear question opens up so many different possibilities to think about this.
I think that's true. I mean, I think that one of the things that struck me about the period that I'm writing about and the way that people are talking about the bomb or the not bomb is that those definitions of war and peace, there are so many competing definitions at that time, particularly because all of this is happening, something I didn't have a lot of time to talk about, within a broader global conversation about disarmament and dissuasion and what does it mean for France to acquire a bomb, and is that participating in the escalation of the threat and possibility of nuclear war in the future, or is France, as de Gaulle and others maintain, by acquiring the bomb, settling, making things, creating an even playing field, and in some weird logic contributing to disarmament, like that there is that discourse as well. So that's all about peace, but it's nuclear peace, or peace with respect to a nuclear war, and this is happening simultaneously with a set of debates and disavowals of what's happening in Algeria as a war. So there's these different levels of wars, and there's different levels of bombs, right? So a bomb set off in the Kasbah is not a nuclear bomb, and so I wanted to kind of explore the fact that those terms are being argued about, but even, and this comes back to what Andy said about the ambivalences, I really struggled with that, trying not to overread the sources that I'm working with, because I think actually that it's not that the French military and state is hiding that setting off these devices in the desert is really a part of the struggle against Algerian independence. I think there's literally blinders on, so that I think some of the denial of any connection between these things that are happening simultaneously is genuine. I mean, in the sense that it's literally not seeing that there's any possible relationship between, I mean, it's the imperial mindset, right, at work. So it's not that there's a conspiracy of, there are some people who talk about setting off these explosives as a way of showing France's power and force in the face of, global powers, but also in the face of Algerian resistance and revolution. But I don't even think that's what's going on most of the time. I think the segregation is genuine in the minds of people like Jules Mock and in de Gaulle's mind, and not that I know what's in de Gaulle's mind, but that sounded crazy.
I think in the context of the First World War, the question on when a war begins and ends is sort of especially timely. In the last couple of years, we've had a sort of spat of scholarship on the origins of the war, and when you look at the First World War from the perspective of the Middle East, is that kind of iconic summer of 1914 date. It really doesn't necessarily look like the beginning of the First World War anymore. Not when you're looking from an Ottoman perspective and you have the Balkan War is immediately preceding, and you have the Italian invasion of Italy, which is perhaps another date that one could argue is actually the beginning of the First World War. Especially given the interrelationship between the Austro-German response to the assassination of the Archduke and the crisis of the Ottoman Empire set off by the Balkan Wars, which is itself set off by the Turkish inability to fight off the Italians. And looking at the back end, I think this is, this is again true, that just as we've in the midst of kind of a redefinition of the beginning of the war, by 2018, I expect we'll be right smack dab in the middle of a redefinition of what the end of the war means. Indeed, we've already begun it. In a place like Turkey, 1918 is definitely not the end of a war. The war never really stops, just as it doesn't really stop if you're in Russia or Poland or the Caucasus. As indeed for Central Asia, the end of the war is actually the beginning of a war which had not been heavily centered in Central Asia. The end brings war to those areas, and from the perspective of these French officers, I think very clearly, they don't think they're in an après-guerre. They think, and this is one area where I do, where I believe that they're expressing what they actually think. They think the war is still going on. That the armistice at Compiègne was merely that, a cessation of a certain aspect of a continuing conflict with outside powers. They don't think that the conflict with Germany is properly over. They don't think the conflict with Turkey has been ended by the armistice at Mudros, and they do not believe, and they believe that the Bolshevik Revolution has turned Russia into a new competitor. And they view this not as a new conflict, but as a continuation of pre-existing colonial conflicts over the division of spoils in the Middle East. And so I think from their perspective, this is a serious concern. And it reveals that they don't see their colonial empires particularly firmly implanted in most of the colonies that they've colored, as I guess the French color things green. If the British color it pink, we color it green. And this is reflected in reports from Morocco at the time, where we should remember, although our maps show Morocco as occupied by France since 1912-ish, the French army itself doesn't actually claim to have occupied all of Morocco until 1934. They put out this giant book celebrating finishing the pacification of Morocco. So I think situating this in a larger conflict helps us see that even the sort of military side of colonialism, which is often taken to be the most secure part of the colonial state, was seen by military officials at the time as a fragile achievement, and one they were still very much in the middle of trying to consolidate, and the questions of colonial borders very much an open question in the minds of military and intelligence leaders.
Can I turn the questions over to the floor at this point? Yes, let's go ahead and see what we've got here. Okay, all right. Please.
Hi, thank you guys all for a great panel. My question is to Roxanne. I loved your paper. I thought it was really, really lovely. My question has to do with the administrative elephant in the room, which is the OCRS, and how the UN debates on the nuclear question are dealing with the OCRS trying to create this kind of bizarre space in the Sahara. And of course, a lot of the African leaders are debating this, whether that's in Mali or Niger, as the work of Baz Lecoq or Greg LeMan, or all of these people are showing from the African side. But to internationalize that discussion, does the question of administrative territory and nuclear proliferation, do they come together? And the second, which continues the other Algeria panel from yesterday, discussion, in thinking about double radiance as a conceptual framework, which I love, which is kind of a post-World War II nation for Gabriel Hecht, right, the radiance of France. What does this change in the Algerian War in terms of psychological warfare or creative destruction, or do some of these technological framings change based on this imperial or quasi-imperial context?
Wow, those are two really great questions. Well, the first one, in terms of sort of the administration of the region, I don't know the answer to that yet. I should say I literally just started this research and this project. So I know from the sort of broader context and some of the research I've done and how disputes about the Sahara, what's going on with disputes about the Sahara separate from this question, that the two things are connected. So I'm going to have to explore that. I think because my focus was on what people won't talk about and what they won't put together, I haven't yet kind of gotten to that place where I'm thinking about the clashes between these different, because the UN is not the only international site where these kinds of conversations are happening, and there's a whole body, I mean, there's a whole archive of the debates of the committees, not just at the UN, but elsewhere on disarmament and the discussion of disarmament where the Algerian war plays a role, right? And then, so all of those things do come together, but I haven't gotten to that part of the project yet, so in essence, I'm not going to answer your question. The second part of it, I guess I want you to say more. When you say, how did radiance change, what specifically are you thinking about when you, oh, sorry, I just wanted you to hold the microphone again.
Sure. So I was wondering if in this, yesterday we were talking a bit about the post-war, and does that make sense as a category? And certainly a lot of historians of science in France see the post-war as this moment where national grandeur and technological advance come into conflict with terroir and other notions of national identity.
Right.
And so if we're going to say, okay, this is an Algeria panel, and we're not just going to inscribe ourselves in this post-war French history, what happens to those notions in Algeria? And this is something that I know a lot of people at this conference are dealing with in their work, but it really came out very clearly in your discussion about, is this the same radiance that we're talking about in France post-war, or is this a different kind of radiance? George Trumbull's work on the Sahara and technology, we might have a panel to organize for Mesa next year, but
I mean, I think it is different. I think it's historically distinct, but I guess for me, the thing that has bothered me, and it's really, I mean, it started with textbooks, right? I kind of got the idea for this project from the textbooks that I used to teach my modern French survey, that the nuclear is sort of always treated as, we moved to technology because we lost empire, so technology is the new way to be modern and the new way to be grand. And especially in this moment that I'm looking at, that notion that there's somehow a trade or that technology and science and the modernity of the nuclear and other fields is the compensation or the thing that France will turn to because of the loss of empire. It's just, it neglects this very crucial, not just initial moment, but a moment that, if the Le Parisien article that I cited at the beginning is any small amount of evidence of this, it was always a continuation of the imperial project. If we think about testing, if we think about the impact on veterans and on civilians, so it's the trade that really bothers me the most, the notion that one type of radiance is exchanged for another, rather than that the two are inextricably linked in this early moment. But it sounds like we have a lot to talk about.
Questions, comments? Yeah, okay.
This one's also for Roxanne, and it might bring Ben in too, because I know we were having a lot of discussions earlier about the lack of discussion of the nuclear problem and histories of Algeria during the war and maybe after. But one of the references we found was in your book about the nuclear facility at Jelfa in the contemporary period, and I'm just wondering about the confluence of the Algerian state post-war taking up the nuclear as a form of modernity that perhaps they're taking from the colonial context, and whether we can see that, or how you found that reference maybe, or what those contexts are, because I'm sort of thinking about the continuities as well between the colonial and the post-colonial within Algeria, and what you're perhaps thinking within that.
Do you want to say how that came up in your?
Thanks for being such a close reader, because that was really a very small part of, if it even I guess it's in a deep footnote somewhere at some point.
It's the part I focused on.
Okay, all right, yeah, thank you. Well, I mean, one of the things I think that I had a graduate student at UT a few years back who was working on post-war atomic energy policy, and I think also weapons programs, and he was talking about this, and I'm very aware that this will be distributed on the internet and so forth. In any case, I think that there's not a whole lot of information about this, and what exactly how that works and so forth. But we could talk about that later. Yeah. Roxanne, do you want to?
Well, I would just say that for some reason I keep thinking about that. Who wrote that essay on the decolonization of cricket? I feel like you should know. Anyway, for whatever reason, that's making me think about it's okay. So the decolonization of the nuclear, that idea that who was it that wrote that essay? I can't remember. That this notion that I think the nuclear in a number of different and Gabrielle Hecht's new work actually looks at some of this. I think that the nuclear can, in fact, be decolonized from the perspective of Algerians, of Polynesians. That there are certain segments of those populations, and then the state and business interests and other kinds of interests who would take it up. And then the question becomes, well, is that a continuation of French imperialism or French interest, or is that the Algerian state in this example, claiming for itself something that may have begun with France, but has? And so I don't know the answer to that, but I think it's a really interesting question, and that doesn't just work, or isn't just important for Algeria, but would be important for Africa. And in Gabrielle Hecht's new work on the uranium trade and stuff, I think she talks about those competing interests, some of which are exploitative, but some of which might involve Africans claiming a certain type of modernity or connection to nuclearity that is not necessarily entirely imperial.
Okay, good. Please.
I just wanted to raise the question very quickly about when wars end. And I think that many wars have power long after even all of the veterans are dead. But certainly with the Algerian War, for example, the current power of the National Front in France suggests the enduring power of the memory of the war. And what we're seeing in terms of the First World War suggests the same thing, that as long as the fallout from a war still evokes passion and emotion, I would say the war is not over. And then as long as there are veterans whose life experience is still defined by the war is not over for them either. So I think that's one of the most provocative things about all these papers. They show how the war, none of these wars are really over. So the very category après-guerre is probably problematic. Maybe the Roman Carthaginian wars are now over. There must be some that are over. But any war that still can provoke action in the present is in some sense still a live war. Is that an accurate way to think about the power of memory and war?
I mean, I think maybe even the Carthaginian, Roman, the Punic Wars are still they still sort of come up in the Tunisian Revolution. There's a reference from time to time.
We're now debating about whether the Sykes-Picot Agreement is coming apart at the seams, right?
Good. We are out of time, so let me take the opportunity to again thank all of our panelists for a very stimulating, engaging panel. Excellent work that you've done, and work that will be ongoing, and we're looking forward to seeing some of it in print in the near future. Yes, so thank you.